Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going to be tackling some ancient wisdom.
Oh, sounds fun.
Yeah, we're diving into an excerpt from MCS Leviticus chapter 18.
Oh, okay.
And it's this chapter from the book of Leviticus, and it's all about, well, it focuses on prohibited sexual practices for the Israelites.
Got it.
So we're going to try to figure out, like, what these prohibitions are, try to understand why they were so important back then.
Right.
And see if maybe there's some modern interpretations we can, like, glean from this ancient text.
Interesting.
And to help me do that, I've got an expert in the house. Well, virtually in the house.
Uh-huh, yeah.
An expert in the historical and cultural context of the Bible.
Well, that's me. Happy to be here.
Great. So Leviticus, I mean, it can be a little bit of a head scratcher, I think, for modern readers.
Oh, for sure.
But, I have a feeling there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. I think you'll find that's true.
So, for those of us who maybe need a little refresher, what's the main idea of Leviticus 18? What's the gist?
Well, it's like at its core, it's a blueprint for social order in, ancient Israel.
Right.
And it's focused specifically on sexual behavior.
Right.
It's God laying down the law, literally for the Israelites, about, what relationships are okay and which ones are totally off limits.
Yeah, and it's very upfront about it, right?
Sure.
It's like, hey, Israelites, listen up. This is God. And I want you to be different.
Exactly.
Right. I want you to be different from the Egyptians and the Canaanites. You've got your own set of rules now.
Right.
It's like following them means life.
It's all about forging a unique identity and establishing clear boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Remember, they were going into the promised land. This was a huge deal.
A fresh start.
A total fresh start. And this chapter is like, here's the guidebook, how to live there.
Right.
In a way that honors God and sets them apart from everyone else around them.
Right. Okay, so let's get into the specifics here.
Okay.
I mean, the source lays out a pretty, extensive list of forbidden relationships.
For sure.
Some of them, seem pretty obvious to us today, right?
Right.
Like, no sexual relationships with your parents or siblings or children.
Right. That makes sense.
But then it gets a little more complicated, right?
Yes.
It gets into relatives through marriage, step-parents and in-laws.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they were really trying to cover all their bases.
Well, I think what's fascinating here is that these rules, they might seem really restrictive, but they were actually less about restricting personal freedom and more about just making sure that everything ran smoothly in the community.
Right.
Clear boundaries.
Maintaining that social harmony.
Yes, exactly. So like with the step family members, for example.
Right.
That could have been, just to try to prevent problems within blended families,
Okay.
Conflicts, power imbalances.
Right.
And so that way, they could ensure stability, unity in the community.
Yeah, it's almost like ancient family therapy in a way.
Yeah, a little bit, right?
It makes you think about, how these prohibitions weren't just like individual things,
Yeah.
but about protecting like the family as a whole.
Exactly. And that's where this whole concept of, uncleanliness comes in.
Yes.
Right? Because the source keeps saying, like, doing these forbidden things makes you unclean,
Yeah.
which, to us, it sounds pretty intense.
It sounds pretty intense, yeah. What did uncleanliness really mean for the Israelites?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just about taking a bath, right?
No, not at all.
It's deeper than that.
It's about, spiritual purity.
Okay.
Being separated from the divine, even like your social standing within the community could be affected.
Okay.
So like becoming unclean, that meant being ritually impure.
Got it.
And you couldn't really participate in religious life.
Okay.
And then, and you might face social consequences.
So it really affected your whole life.
Oh, yeah. It was a big deal.
It wasn't just like a rule you broke.
No, it was like this barrier between you and God and maybe even you and, your community.
Right. Okay. So these rules, they weren't just like random.
No.
They were like really connected to their whole belief system.
Yes. Their relationship with God, their place in the community. Yeah.
Okay. Starting to see the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
There are a couple of other prohibitions that really stand out.
Okay.
Like, for example, no sex with a woman during her period.
Right.
And no polygamy, specifically taking a woman as a rival to her sister.
Yes.
So any thoughts on the reasoning behind these rules, especially back then,
Absolutely. So the one about sex during menstruation, that probably had a lot of, different reasons for it.
Okay.
Hygiene and health considerations for sure, given what they knew back then about the female body.
Okay.
But it also, probably had to do with ideas about ritual purity.
Okay.
And the sacredness of certain bodily functions.
It's interesting because it seems like, even back then, they understood that you had to respect a woman's physical state and boundaries.
Yes.
I mean, the reasoning might have been different, but, maybe we can see a thread of that concern for women's autonomy throughout history.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating thought. And as for polygamy, the specific prohibition against, taking a woman as a rival to her sister, that kind of suggests that they were worried about jealousy and strife within families.
Right.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, remember, this was all about keeping the peace, maintaining social harmony.
Yeah.
And to do that, you got to minimize conflict within families, the foundation of society.
Yeah, the building blocks.
Yeah, keep those strong and unified.
Right. And then we come to, what the source calls severe transgressions.
Right.
Child sacrifice to Molech, homosexual acts, and bestiality.
Yes. These were the, really bad ones in their eyes.
The big no-nos.
Yeah, really a direct affront to God and like a threat to their whole, way of life, the moral fabric of the community.
The source, it actually calls them abominations.
Yeah, strong language.
Which, that just shows how seriously they took these transgressions.
For sure. Child sacrifice especially was, probably so abhorrent because, it involved taking an innocent life.
Of course.
And it was usually associated with foreign deities, so it felt like a betrayal of their covenant with God.
Right, yeah.
And the prohibitions against homosexual acts and bestiality, those probably reflected this emphasis on, having kids, continuing the Israelite lineage.
Right.
Which was essential for their survival and also their sense of, being chosen by God.
Okay, so it was about setting them apart, reinforcing their identity and their special relationship with God, and making sure their people continued.
Exactly.
So, yeah, these laws might seem really strict to us now.
Oh, yeah.
But they were really designed to address, specific issues.
Yes, very specific concerns and challenges within their historical and cultural context.
Right. Their world was just so different.
It was. So it's easy to judge them now,
Yeah.
But we have to try to understand the bigger picture.
Right. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's this one more point in the source I want to unpack.
Okay.
It talks about how defiling the land, through disobedience, that would lead to the land, get this, vomiting out its inhabitants.
Oh, yeah. That's some imagery.
That's pretty vivid, right?
Wow.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think it shows just how connected they felt to the land.
Right.
Remember, this was the promised land given to them by God.
Right.
And so keeping it pure and living according to God's laws, that was super important.
For them to stay there.
Yeah, for them to stay there and prosper.
So it wasn't just about, personal morality. It was their relationship with the land, their survival, their covenant with God, all wrapped up together.
It's almost like this, back and forth relationship, right?
Give and take.
Yeah, the land nourishes the people, but the people got to take care of the land.
Right, yeah.
And uphold God's laws on it. And if they disobey, they break that covenant.
And bad things happen.
Bad things happen to the people and to the land.
And it's interesting, right? Because this idea, this ancient idea, it kind of connects with modern environmental concerns.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we say it differently now. But that idea of responsibility,
yeah,
that our actions have consequences, that those consequences affect, more than just us.
That's a powerful concept, yeah.
Yeah, they affect the natural world too. That's a big deal today.
It is, for sure.
And I'm glad you brought that up because the source doesn't just, leave these laws in the past.
No.
It says that this call to be different, it also applies to modern day believers in Jesus.
Right.
What it calls the community of witnesses.
Interesting. So how do these ancient laws, from such a different time, how can they be relevant or even applicable to us now?
That's a great question, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that. But before we dive into that, how these ancient prohibitions might speak to today's issues, maybe let's take a little break.
Yeah, good idea.
Let all this information sink in a bit.
Good plan. It's amazing to think about, how these ancient rules, they might actually offer some insights into modern relationships,
Yeah.
How we handle power dynamics, ethical challenges, What do you think?
Yeah, I'm still kind of wrestling with that myself, to be honest.
It's tricky.
It's hard, right? Because how do you glean that wisdom from these ancient texts, but without imposing a literal interpretation on today's world?
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
It's a delicate balance, right? Where do we even start to bridge that gap?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that, okay, so the specific cultural context, that's changed.
Right, of course.
Totally different. But But the principles, the ideas underneath those rules,
Yeah,
like
right.
respect, responsibility, protecting the vulnerable,
Yeah.
those are timeless.
Okay, so it's less about the letter of the law
Yes.
and more about those core values, like extracting those
Exactly.
and then seeing how those might be relevant today.
Exactly. Take the prohibition against incest, for example. Obviously, we all agree that's wrong, right?
Yeah.
But the specific relationships outlined in Leviticus, those might seem obvious to us now.
Okay.
But the idea behind it,
Yeah.
protecting vulnerable people from exploitation within the family, I mean, that's still a huge issue.
Yeah. That's a really good point. We might not use the same language. We don't talk about uncleanliness in the same way.
Yeah.
But the idea of harm,
Yeah.
abuse of power,
Yeah.
and protecting those who are most susceptible to that, I mean, that's a constant throughout history.
Yes, it is a thread that runs through human history. And
Yeah.
it's not just family stuff either. Think about that prohibition about, sex with a woman during her period.
Okay.
That could also be viewed through the lens of consent and bodily autonomy.
Right. Yeah.
Even though their reasons might have been different back then.
Yeah.
But the idea of respecting a woman's physical state, her boundaries,
Yeah.
that has echoes in all these modern discussions
I think you're
about
right.
reproductive rights, sexual consent,
It's true. Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But you're right. It's like we can see these concerns for human dignity, for well-being, and they've been there all along,
Right. Throughout history.
even if we express them differently now.
Exactly. And that evolution is key.
Yeah.
We can't just take these old laws and force them onto today's society,
Right.
but we can have a conversation with them.
Okay.
We can explore those underlying principles, those values,
Yep.
and see how they might, help us understand ethical challenges today.
So it's like taking inspiration from the past, but not like trying to use it as a rule book.
Not a rule book, more like a guide,
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
It's about asking, what were they trying to achieve with these laws?
Yeah.
What were they trying to prevent?
Right.
And then, even though the language is different, can those insights help us navigate similar challenges?
Right. It's like we're having this conversation across time.
I like that.
We're acknowledging like the similarities and the differences.
Exactly.
And then we can use those insights to like shed light on our world today.
Exactly. Now, remember earlier you were talking about how these laws were in part about setting the Israelites apart from their neighbors.
Right. Yeah.
But the source also says that those surrounding nations, they were defiled by their practices.
Yes.
And that the land itself became unclean because of that.
Yeah, that's the part that always like makes me uncomfortable.
It's tough.
It feels judgmental, like they're looking down on other cultures. And how do we reconcile that with, today's ideas of tolerance and accepting different cultures?
It's a good question, and I think the key is to remember that these texts, they come from a very specific perspective,
Okay.
a cultural and religious perspective,
Right.
The Israelites, they saw themselves as God's chosen people.
Yeah.
They had this special covenant, a unique way of life.
Yeah.
So when they talk about defilement, it's about that sense of separation,
Right.
and that their practices, they were divinely ordained.
So it's less about condemning others.
Yeah.
And more about maintaining their own identity.
I think that's a fair way to look at it. We can't just take our modern ideas of tolerance and apply them to these ancient texts. We have
Right.
to understand them within their own worldview.
Right. Their own context.
Exactly. But I do think we can still appreciate that underlying message
Okay.
about how people, their actions, they affect the community and the land.
Right.
It's a theme you see in a lot of, spiritual and philosophical traditions,
Yeah.
that our choices have ripple effects, that we're all connected.
Even if we might use different words now.
Right, exactly. But that idea of responsibility, our
Yeah.
actions having consequences, that's still powerful.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about the specific rules, the reasons behind them,
Right.
and how they might connect to modern issues.
Yeah.
But the source also says that disobeying these laws, that would lead to being cut off from the people.
Yeah, what did that mean?
It sounds harsh.
It does sound pretty hard.
It was serious. It probably meant a lot of different things,
Right.
like social penalties,
Like what?
ostracism, being excluded from religious rituals,
Oh, wow.
being shut out of community life.
Yeah.
And, back then, being part of the community, that was crucial
For survival.
for survival, for everything. So being cut off, it meant losing that support system.
Right.
You were on your own.
So it wasn't just like punishment from God. It was like really affecting your life, your day-to-day life.
Absolutely. It shows how important social cohesion was to their survival.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that even today, what we do has consequences,
Nope.
not just for us,
Right.
but for the people around us, our communities.
We're all connected.
We are. And even though we might not face the same penalties as they did,
Right.
our choices still affect our social standing, our sense of belonging.
That's a good point. Makes you think.
It does. It makes you think about the responsibilities we have to each other.
Yeah.
It's not just about following the rules.
Right.
It's about contributing to the well-being of everyone.
Right. Building each other up.
Yeah. And that brings us back to those principles, respect, responsibility, protecting the vulnerable.
Yeah.
Those are the things that make a community thrive, whether it's ancient Israel or today.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how all this fits together.
Yeah.
The laws, the concept of uncleanliness, the consequences of breaking those laws.
It's all connected.
It's all like this system.
It is.
And to guide behavior, keep order, and uphold their way of life.
Precisely. It's a glimpse into their world,
Yeah.
how they understood morality, spirituality, community. It's fascinating.
It really challenges the way we think about things today.
It does. It makes us think.
Okay, well, we've unpacked a lot of heavy stuff,
We have.
but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have.
I really want to hear your thoughts on how we connect these ancient laws to modern life.
Okay.
How do we take those insights without getting stuck in those literal interpretations?
Right. Yeah, that's the key.
Okay, so we've explored a lot, the specific things you can't do in Leviticus 18, the reasoning behind it all, and even how some of it connects to ethical questions we have today.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
But I'm still really trying to wrap my head around how to connect these ancient laws to today's world, you know?
Right. It's not a simple thing.
It feels tricky because you want to find the wisdom in these old texts.
Yeah.
But you don't want to just force those old rules on everyone today.
No, absolutely not.
It's like walking a tightrope, finding that balance.
It is. It's a challenge for sure.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think the key is moving beyond that simple idea of you're either with us or against us.
Yeah.
And instead really engaging with these texts, but in a thoughtful, nuanced way. You got to be willing to ask the tough questions, challenge your own assumptions,
Yeah.
and be open to the possibility that even these ancient texts, they can offer new perspectives on the problems we face today.
So not looking at Leviticus this is the rule book, the set of rules everyone has to follow.
Right.
But more it's a starting point.
Yeah, like a conversation starter.
A conversation about values and how we apply those values in a world that's always changing.
Exactly. It's like having this wise old mentor, whispering in your ear.
Okay. Yeah.
We might not agree with everything they say, but we can still listen carefully, think about what they're saying, and see what makes sense to us.
Right.
And I think what really speaks to us from Leviticus 18 are those core principles.
Okay, the ones we talked about before.
Yeah, protecting the vulnerable, consent, the need for harmony in society, and understanding that our actions have consequences that go way beyond just us.
And those are ideas that keep popping up.
Oh, yeah.
And all these discussions we're having today about ethics.
Absolutely.
We see them when we talk about sexual abuse and exploitation, power imbalances in big institutions.
Yeah, like governments, corporations.
And even the ethical stuff around new technologies, how they affect society. It's kind of wild that these ancient concerns are still relevant today.
It is. It shows how powerful those ideas are.
For sure.
Think about, all the discussions about sexual abuse, especially within institutions like churches or schools.
Yeah.
Now, the specific rules in Leviticus, they might not translate directly to these situations, but that principle of protecting those who are vulnerable,
Yeah.
especially when there's a power imbalance, that is so relevant today.
Makes you think.
It encourages us to really look at how power works, to speak out against abuse, and to fight for systems that actually protect the weak and the marginalized.
It's like we're seeing those same concerns, but they're reflected in our own struggles for justice, for equality.
Yes, exactly.
But it's not just about institutions either.
No, it's personal too.
In our relationship.
Yes, how we treat each other.
Examining our own behavior.
Yeah, are we treating people with respect, with dignity, with care?
It's like taking responsibility for our actions.
Yes, and thinking about how they might affect others, even in small ways.
It's like this call to be aware, ethically aware, in everything we do.
Exactly. How do we make sure our relationships are built on consent, respect, understanding?
That's a big one.
How do we navigate all the complexities of intimacy, desire, while making sure everyone's okay?
Yeah.
How do we use whatever power we have, whether it's in our family or at work or in our community, how do we use that power without hurting people?
Right.
Leviticus 18, even though it's so old, it makes us think about these questions.
It's almost like a tool for introspection, for looking inward, both personally and as a society.
I like that, yeah.
We can look at these prohibitions not as these outdated rules, but as this like mirror, reflecting our own values
Yes.
back at us
Yes.
and challenging us to actually live up to them.
It's about finding those threads of wisdom that connect us across time and cultures,
Yeah.
and using them to build a world that's more just, more compassionate, more ethical.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's not about forcing the past onto the present.
No.
It's about like taking the best of both
Yes.
and creating something new, something meaningful.
And that's the challenge, right?
It is.
To keep this conversation going, to keep wrestling with these tough issues,
And keep learning.
and to try to build a society that reflects our best selves.
So well said. I think we've really covered a lot today.
I think so.
From like the nitty-gritty of Leviticus 18
Yeah,
to these bigger questions about ethics and morality.
it's all connected.
So as we wrap up, what's one last thought you'd like to leave our listeners with as they, keep thinking about these ideas?
Just be curious. Be humble when you approach these old texts. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions, to challenge what you think you know,
Yeah.
and find those points of connection, the parts that speak to your own values, your own experiences.
Right.
These texts, they've survived for so long because they touch on something deep about what it means to be human.
Right.
It's up to each of us to figure out what that is and how it can shape our lives today.
That's a great takeaway. Thank you so much for guiding us through this. It's been really fascinating.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine, really.
And to all our listeners, keep those minds working. Keep asking those questions and keep talking about these things. The journey of like figuring out what's right and wrong, it never really ends.
It doesn't.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.